All right, so welcome back. This is going to be the second half for this week's lecture. I'm going to go ahead and share out the PowerPoint once again. We're going to be looking at Chapter 8 in this video. Chapter 8 consists of negligence and strict liability in our tort system or civil system, how we look at those type of cases. We're going to look at negligence first. It's a breach of the duty of care. We'll talk about who has a duty of care and how that applies. We'll look at factual cause, what that means, the scope of liability, harm as it consists, and the defenses that we do have to negligence. And then we'll talk about strict liability. If you'll remember last week, there was a real quick part of strict liability that had to do with criminal charges. We'll talk about those in the civil system, what strict liability applies to with those, and the defenses to strict liability. A person is under a duty to all others at all times to exercise reasonable care for the safety of others, person and property, others, person and property. So think about what that means, that at all times we're under a duty of care, or we're under a duty to make sure that we're looking out for the reasonable care of others. That's not doing anything that could cause them harm, making sure that our actions are not causing that. There is not a general duty to avoid unintentional economic loss, though, when it comes to that. So we talked about intentional torts the last video and what intent was in that setting. So we're not looking at intent in this time or this setting. We're looking at negligence. So for negligence, we need a little bit more information. We need a few more pieces to be in place. For someone to be negligent, we must prove that they have a duty of care. They have breached that duty. They are the factual cause of the harm that happened. There was a harm, and what their scope of liability in that negligence and in the case would be. So let's first talk about the breach of a duty of care. To understand this, we have to understand what the reasonable person standard is. Degree of care that a reasonable person would exercise under all circumstances. We most of the time think of ourselves as reasonable individuals. So the reasonable person standard is what we would apply to ourselves when it comes to how we take care of someone, how we complete our duty of care to others. The reasonable person standard, though, may not be exactly what we consider when we think of us being as reasonable individuals. So for children, they must conform to the conduct of a reasonable person of the same age, intelligence, and experience under all the circumstances. So you think about a 5-year-old, their age, the intelligence of a 5-year-old, normally they might know how to, spell their name depending on what they have learned at that point. They might know some of their letters. They may not be able to spell their name specifically, but they might know some of their letters, probably their colors. And that's going to really and truly consist of it. Their experiences will probably be what they watched on TV, what type of cartoons or instructional TV they've watched, those type of things, right? So there's not a lot. We translate it up to someone in their late teens, early 20s. They're going to have a little bit more intelligence. They should have by that point. If they do not, that would put them into a disability category, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but that would put them to the point of, having a higher degree of liability when it comes to a circumstance by being expected to have a more reasoned way of thinking when it comes to certain circumstances. We even take that further to someone that's maybe their late 20s, early 30s, and there may even be a higher expectation of their reasonable intelligence and their experiences up to that point. So for someone to be looked at, children, it's going to be looking at someone who matches their standards, their age, their intelligence, their experience. Physical disability, if someone is physically disabled, that person's conduct must conform to that of a reasonable person with the same disability. All right. So we're not going to expect someone to meet the reasonable standard of someone who may have more ability than them or a higher intelligence level, more experience at an older age than what they are at. So that reasonable person standard applies at different levels depending upon where we are. Someone who has a mental disability or they're different. Different standard here is also going to be held to the reasonable standard of someone in that same level as they are. Then we take those that have superior skill or knowledge, they're held to a higher standard. If a person has skills or knowledge beyond those possessed by most others, their skills or their knowledge or circumstances be taken into account in determining whether the person acted with reasonable care. Your reasonable care, my reasonable care in an operating room would not be the same as someone who is a doctor, who has gone through their surgical training, who is considered a surgeon, right? We would not be expected to do it. We would not be expected to be in that situation to where someone who has had the training and has gone through the schooling, which is passed their exams to be considered a surgeon, the standard they would be held to would be completely different from someone who, in a moment of crisis, maybe tried to help someone out in those circumstances. So superior skill and knowledge is going to be a different standard there also. The standard for emergencies is a reasonable person. They're not and would reply to an unexpected emergency is considered to be part of the circumstances. So the reasonable person standard applies in emergency. So think about someone of the same intelligence or near same intelligence, same experience. They're not highly skilled if they do not carry high skill in an area that the emergency fits into. Those are taken into an unexpected emergency, which may change a person's ability to cope with what the circumstance is going on. That is also going to be taken into consideration in some of those circumstances, not in all instances in the circumstances going on. If it's a violation of statute, if there's a statute that applies, then it would be negligence per se in most states if they're violating a statute in some way. All right, so negligence per se. We're going to look at D. Does D's conduct violate any statute? If no, then we look at their conduct reasonable under the circumstances. If their conduct was reasonable under circumstances, they're not liable. All right, so we're going to look at their reasonable conduct in this situation. If we take it to the other way that they violate a statute, does the statute expressly provide for civil liberty? If not, then is the statute intended to protect a class of persons, which includes P, from a type of hazard or harm? If we have a no on this, we're once again going to go back to the reasonable ability of their, or the reasonableness of their conduct under those circumstances. If we have yes with these, then we're going to go down to them being liable for the causation and protected harm of the person when it's proven. All right. So if their conduct is reasonable under circumstances, if it was not, then we go back to them being liable. If the statute protects this and they're violating that statute, then we go back to that also. All right. So there's a couple of things we have to look at here. A statute or a law that expressly provides for civil liberty of a person, and that person would be in a protected class. If something was to happen to protect them from that type of harm, then we have liability. If we cannot show those elements, then we go back to was the person's conduct, was D's conduct reasonable under the circumstances as we saw it? If it was, then we do not have a liability issue here, and that is negligence per se. All right, a duty to act. Our normal duty to act is that we act in such a way where we do not cause harm to others. We do not put their safety in jeopardy or of their person or their property. We do not do anything that could cause them to be harmed in any way. This does not, however, apply if we are seeing someone who is putting their self in jeopardy, and we're not required to aid someone in peril. There is not a requirement upon the average everyday citizen to act if someone is in harm's way or in peril in such a way that it goes outside of what our level of knowledge, our skills, our circumstances would be. Uh, if we fall back to those with exceptional skill, someone who has had exceptional or extensive medical training, someone in peril, they would be required to act because they may be considered a first responder. First responders are required to act if they see someone in peril. Law enforcement, in most cases, are first responders. Fire and rescue, first responders. Other training, if you're a certified first responder, may fit within that. The duties to possessors of land. So we think back to the last video, we talked about the protections of land as a protection against trespass on someone's property, their land, or their home, whatever it may be. The duties that we have as landowners are that we are not uh, to harm trespassers intentionally. Uh, there are the best way to put this is that people will sometimes place things on property, whether it may be obstacles or items to injure those who are coming on their property uh, without their permission. Digging a pit in an area that is known for trespassers to go that could cause them harm. Having exceptionally dangerous animals to protect property. That is not allowed by law. You cannot do something that you're intentionally meaning to injure someone who is trespassing. We have laws to protect against trespassers, to protect us as landowners against trespassers. There are also laws to protect those trespassers from intentional harm by the landowner. We also, if we are a landowner and we allow others to come on that property through a licensing, whether it is someone who is allowed, if it is a large area of land that allows individuals to hunt on that land during hunting season, we give them a lease or they have a license to come in that property. We are to warn them of any known dangerous conditions. If there is a swampy area on land that has a high number of venomous snakes or uh, alligators, whatever it may be, we are to warn them before they come on it. The same is where when you see a public boat ramp and there's a sign, you see them everywhere in Florida because whatever lake it may be in Florida, it's going to be part of what we deal with. You will see signs that show alligators may be present in the area. Uh, there's not many bodies of water you can go to in the state of Florida that are larger bodies of water where the likelihood of you seeing an alligator is very small. The likelihood is normally going to be there, especially if there's cypress and other things on those lines. There's a readily accessible food source. They're going to be there. So those signs allow us to know that that is going to happen. Businesses have this same type of duty when it comes to high levels of crime that may happen on their premises. You let others know that this is something that is going to be there. That falls more into strict liability when we get to it. We'll see a little bit tighter definition of how that applies. But as owners of property or possessor of land, if there's any undue harm or extremely dangerous situations and conditions that could happen, we are to let those that we allow on that property for whatever reason know that there are some issues there. It extends also to those we invite on that property. We exercise reasonable care to protect them from any dangerous conditions that we would know about if they were but they may be unlikely to discover without being harmed by it. That could be as simple as you invite someone to your home, and maybe you have a porch that has boards that may be rotted or broken. You A good idea is to let those coming know that, hey, watch out for this section. Or if your yard has areas that may be uneven, there may be holes in it. Maybe you have a dog that digs in your yard. Let them know that, hey, when you walk up, follow the path, because if you step off in the yard part, there may be a hole that the dog's dug that you may not see, especially if they're coming in times of darkness. They're coming at night, like this time of the year when it gets dark earlier. You may have folks coming over for whatever reason. Let them know there could be some way they could be injured. That protects you and them. If you let them know it's there, you can, show that you have done what you're supposed to protect the negligence of them being harmed. By being that you don't necessarily have to go run out there and cover all those holes in. If you do, that's fine, but just letting them know is important so that there's not an issue with them being harmed. Res ipsa loquitur permits the jury to infer both negligent conduct and causation on someone. So if you're negligent and what you did is a cause of the harm, digging holes, those type of things to harm trespassers, they can infer the negligent conduct on you by not letting them know and not protecting them because of that. And if you dug the holes, you're the cause of it. This could also be where someone has not done their due diligence in protecting those who may come on their property by harms they know about. We would look into the factual cause. The defendant's conduct is a factual cause of the harm, when the harm would not have occurred absent their conduct. Once again, those digging of holes, having damaged property that you have damaged, having dangerous animals, those type of things could be there. Scope of liability looks at proximate cause. So the scope of liability is limited to those harms that result from the risk that made the defendant's conduct torturous. So whatever you've done that made your conduct something that caused harm to them through your negligence, it's limited to that. So they can't bring other instances in. It's just to this specific conduct that happened and the risks that were made because of it. Foreseeability excludes liability for harms that were sufficiently unforeseeable at the time of the defendant's conduct, that they were not among the risks that made the defendant negligent. You had a broken porch, you had holes in the yard. Those are things you should have foresaw that could be an issue. A tree limb that may be rotted from the inside that you didn't see, that the wind knocks down on someone's vehicle, not necessarily a deal with negligence on your part. It may have been something that was unforeseeable. If you can prove it was unforeseeable, that may be something that does not lead to the others. Now, if they twist their ankle in one of the holes and they fall through the porch and receive a cut that requires them to get medical attention, that could be from your conduct, your negligence. The tree falling and maybe crushing their vehicle or causing them harm would not necessarily be your negligence. That would be something that could be considered unforeseeable at the time of the other tortuous conduct that was happening, not torturous, but tortuous conduct that was happening and caused other harms to take place. Superseding cause is an intervening act that relieves the defendant of the liability. If they intervene in some way showing that they tried to fix it or tried to prevent harm, then they could be given relief from being negligent in that way. So once again, we're going to look at legally protected interest. The courts will determine what interests are protected from negligent interference. The burden of proof in this, the plaintiff must prove that the defendant's negligent conduct caused the harm to a legally protected interest. So they have to prove that the negligent act caused the harm to a legally protected interest, their person, their property, those type of things, legally protected interest. Defenses to negligence, when we look at negligence or contributory negligence. Now we'll look at this to also see how damages can be assessed. So contributory negligence, a failure of a plaintiff to exercise reasonable care for their own protection, which in a few states can prevent them from recovering anything at all. There are still states that will look at contributory negligence and prevent an individual who has been harmed from receiving any type of compensation if the defense can prove that they in any way, the plaintiff in any way contributed to their own harm. Now, contributory negligence is in opposition to what is called comparative negligence. In the state of Florida, we have comparative negligence. In a court case from the 70s, the Supreme Court of the state of Florida moved the negligence claims and how compensation is given to the comparative negligence as opposed to contributory negligence, which was used up to that point. In the state of Florida, we look at the amount of negligence that the plaintiff may have had. So damages are divided between the parties in proportion to their degree of negligence. Most all states use this. There are still a few that use contributory, but most use comparative. Comparative negligence means that if you are 10% at fault, then you would lose 10% of the award, and that would go to the defendant. In most cases, that means that 90% of what was asked for in the compensatory damages will be awarded to the plaintiff, and that 10% will just not have to be paid by the defendant. It would be the same as it being paid to them out of pocket. Assumption of risk is that the plaintiff's express consent to encounter a known danger will still apply implied assumption of risk. Some states still apply that, but for the most part, when you take on some assumption of the risk, then that would also diminish the amount of those damages. So damages under the two different types. All right, if we're looking at comparative negligence here, a good way of looking at that, if a plaintiff is 40% responsible, the defendant is 60% responsible, we reduce the compensatory damages by 40%. All right, that is normally what we've asked for. Punitive damages are not affected by comparative negligence. So if the jury awards punitive damages on top of the compensatory damages that have been asked for, punitive damages being the way that the courts would say we want to dissuade any others from this action that the defendant has done, then we award some type of punishment, a punitive damage, that is not diminished by any type of comparative negligence on the part of the plaintiff. So even if they are that 40% responsible, we only reduce the compensatory damages. So if they ask for $100,000 in compensatory damages, we reduce it by 40%. In other words, we're taking $40,000 off their damage award. We will still award them $60,000. Plus, if the punitive damages awarded by the jury are $1 million, the plaintiff will receive $1,060,000 based upon what the math for compensatory damages or what the math for comparative negligence would carry. So that $100,000 that was asked for, we reduce $40,000 from it, giving them that $60,000. We also give them the $1 million in punitive damages. So $1,060,000 would be the total award given in a case where comparative negligence comes into play. The defenses to negligent action is the defendant negligent? If we find that they're not negligent, then they win their side of the suit. They do not pay out anything. Countersuits may be brought in those instances, and that would have to be looked at. But in a suit where it is just the plaintiff against the defendant has not filed a countersuit. If the defendant's not found negligent, then they would prevail and they would not have to pay out damages. Has the plaintiff assumed a risk? If they did, then once again, the defendant is, they would prevail in that case. If they did not, is the plaintiff contributory negligent? If it is a state that looks at contributory negligence, then the defendant prevails. They would not have to pay out anything. Once again, comparative is damages are then apportioned as according to the amount of negligence of the parties. If we're looking at that, there's a no there, then did the defendant have a last clear chance to prevent the harm from happening? If they did, they would lose the case. If they did not, then we would have them prevailing if the other circumstances come into play here. All right. So last clear chance is that they had the last opportunity to prevent the harm from happening. If they did, they would lose the case based upon that doctrine. Strict liability, liability for non-intentional and non-negligent conduct. So before we get into strict liability, I want to go back and look at something real quick. I want to make sure. Okay. So before we get into strict liability, I want to go back a few slides and look at this, what we are looking at for harm here. All right, reasonable person standard. The reasonable care a person has should give reasonable care. The reasonable person standard. So we didn't go fully into the reasonable person standard, and I want to take just a couple of minutes to explain that. So I said at the beginning of this that most of us consider ourselves reasonable persons. The reasonable person standard is, in most instances, in almost every instance, the reasonable person standard is that the action and the decision made would be one made by someone who is never angry, never intoxicated or under the influence of any type of substance that could alter their state of mind, and never sleep deprived. Okay, so that is a reasonable person standard. Their actions are such that they would not be done by someone who is sleep deprived, not be done by someone who is under the influence, and not be done by someone who is in a state of anger. Reasonable person standard applies that a reasonable person would not be in those situations and act in any way. So a reasonable person would not act or not do anything that could be harmful to someone else if they are, drunk, under the influence of drugs, they're tired, they're angry, those type of things. So the reasonable person standard holds that a person would not act based upon those. All right, now let's get to those defenses. Or to strict liability. So strict liability is liability for non-intentional or non-negligent conduct. Activities that can give rise to that are abnormally dangerous activities. It's imposed for any activity that creates a foreseeable and highly significant risk of harm, and it's not one of common usage. Something that is a highly foreseeable, or that's foreseeable and a highly significant risk of harm could be something like bungee jumping, race car driving, skydiving, those type of things. There are safety pieces in place, but they do have a foreseeable and high risk of harm involved in those. Others include the keeping of dangerous animals. If we keep wild animals, which require certain permits, if a person has those, then there is liability imposed for the keeping of that. Strict liability. I remember when I was a child, my grandfather was a pastor, and we would go to houses when he would go visit people. And I can distinctly remember one of the places we went when he was pastoring a church in Palaca, Florida. There was a man who had a pet alligator, kept it in a little kiddie pool, one of those little blue pools you can buy at Walmart. He kept the alligator tied up, and the alligator could get in there to cool off or whatever. That would be a condition where someone has a wild animal that could cause harm, that's known to cause harm, those type of things. if your animal trespasses on someone else's property and bites them or harms their property, does something destructive, then you also have a strict liability issue that arises from that. If it is a strict liability issue, contributory negligence does not apply to it. You cannot take into account the plaintiff's contribution to the act or contribution to their harm in strict liability to defend against that, to not have to pay out damages. Some states will apply comparative negligence doctrine in strict liability cases and reduce the award, but it's not in all states. Pardon me. Defense to strict liability is also assumption of risk. Express assumption of risk is a defense to an action based upon strict liability. Some states will apply implied assumption of risk to strict liability cases. If someone assumes the risk, then that can be a defense to it. And that completes this section of it. So keep in mind those defenses there. That contributory negligence does not act as a defense to strict liability, but comparative negligence in some states does fit that. All right, so that covers and completes this week's lecture on the material. If you have any questions, please reach out. There'll be a mini video. I'm going to do it today. Matter of fact, here in the next hour or so, I'll be doing the video and posting it about the case studies. Now that I've got everything completed, I also have we have a few quizzes that have now been completed that I want to discuss those about how responses to those and where points are being lost in those. All right, so kind of to help you out as we're getting close to the midpoint here, at least getting close to the midterm, kind of help you out with what is expected moving forward. All right. Thank you very much, and stay safe and study hard.